Hi everyone, this is Dr. Surasinghe again with our general ecology lecture continuation. We are going to talk about population dynamics in this lecture. So, let me get to my laser pointer. Okay, so what kind of critical processes affect population growth, right? Birth, death, immigration, emigration, right? So you know the meaning of these terms already, right? And then so how do we kind of combine these processes, right? All of those are population scale processes. How do you combine all of them to understand how population changes with respect to these parameters, with respect to these four variables? So if you look at this equation, like n sub t plus 1, right, is actually the future population size, right? In fact, it's plus 1, so it's a after a unit time, population size after unit time from nt, right? So nt is the population size at time t, right? And then in order to predict future population size, you need to add number of births, letter b, and add number of immigrations. So immigrations is actually the phenomena where individuals move from one population to another, and you subtract the number of individuals that died in the population and the number of individuals that emigrated, meaning those individuals that left this focal population and joined another population. Okay, so that's actually the basic mathematical calculation of population growth or population reduction, right? Certain populations may actually continue to shrink. Mm. Now there are different patterns of population growth. Um, we you should be familiar with, by now, these different growth models. We talked about exponential and geometric growth, logistic growth, population fluctuations. It's something that we didn't talk about yet. And then of course population cycles. All of those, the population growth curves, and the population fluctuations and periodic population cycles are different patterns that populations grow, right? Um, so when we were talking about the population ecology lecture last time, I kind of even gave you examples. What would be an example that following geometric growth? What would be an example for exponential? What would be an example for logistic growth? Now, a single population can actually, not just a single species, a single population in certain cases can actually undergo all of those um, population growth patterns, right? Yes, in many cases you can, conservatively judge a particular assign conceptually assign a particular population growth pattern to a particular population or a particular species, but there are several cases where a single population will undergo all of those multiple forms. So know that those population growth patterns are not necessarily mutually exclusive from each other, right? Exponential growth occurs particularly when living conditions are quite favorable. You should know that already, and particularly if those favorable growth conditions are unpredictable, right? And for example, good weather conditions and increased food resource availability within a particular geographic range will favor a particular population to shift into an exponential growth or a geometric growth if the reproduction of that particular species is periodic. A species expanding their geographical range, right, by dispersion or assisted migration or assisted introductions. If a particular species expanded their original geographical range, you will also experience that particular populations being exposed to new resources, unlimited or relatively wide array of resources, so they will also undergo exponential growth. Now remember this, what do you mean by expanding their geographical ranges? It happens two ways. Naturally, rarely in certain cases, certain species are known to naturally disperse from one location, from their natal habitat, from their original habitat into another. That could happen naturally, particularly for birds. And in this case, I'm showing an example based on cattle egret to my right over here, how they actually did what you call a jump dispersal from their African original habitats and actually migrated into North and South America, as well as into parts of Asia, which you don't see right now here, right? But in the top map, you kind of see that the complete geographical range, and these are natural geographical range. This jump dispersal is natural. We don't fully understand what make them do this dispersal. Probably greater competition in the African continent, and we know Africa has a great diversity of birds, wetland birds in particular, and these egrets are wetland birds. So maybe it is that resource competition that drove their jump dispersal into other parts of the old world as well as new world. So, and other than that, there are certain instances where humans intervene and assist their dispersal. That could happen accidentally. Particularly most of the invasive species we have around the world are actually forms of assisted introductions. Most of them are unintentional, a few of them are intentional, without knowing the noxious consequences. So in those situations, let's assume a particular species being accidentally introduced from Eastern Asia to the United States, right? I mean, they actually are comparable climates. They are both temperate climates, right? So if you introduce some sort of an Asian species, an Eastern Asian species to United States, or a European species to United States, right? One of the example that I can think of is house finches. It's actually an intentionally introduced, from Europe to North America by European colonists, right? When you first introduce those house finches, they actually, are exposed to the very similar northern temperate climates. So, and there's plenty of resources, right? And and then there's nothing to compete with them because they actually or nothing to limit their growth because they don't have any natural predators. They kind of expanded and increased dramatically in their population size, and then they followed an exponential growth pattern. The same thing happened to cattle egrets, which actually followed a natural jump dispersal, accessing resources in southern part in North America as well as in South America. Particularly, they were doing exceptionally well in South America because of the tropical climate in terms of expanding their population sizes they followed an exponential growth pattern. The question is now, I earlier mentioned that these growth patterns are particular population can jump from one growth pattern to another. So we know that exponential or geometric growth cannot practically happen indefinitely, right? If when the population size reaches a particular level, what happens is now they become resource limited. The exponential growth happened because of the resource availability, but at the same time, when the population size increases, then the unlimited resources now becomes limited. Hence, the density dependent population growth regulators kicks in, right? So now motility happens, or it also limits the introduction of newer individuals through births or through immigration, right? So when density dependent factors kicks in, the growth ceases, right? And you might even see a certain plummet of their growth patterns, plummeting of the population size. And ultimately what happens is with time, they will again regain some of the population sizes, and ultimately they might actually stabilize. So they will switch from either exponential or a geometric growth, and then they will undergo some sort of a population decline, and then ultimately reaches stability, right? and after they reach the stability, they could actually undergo regular population cycles or undergo minor population fluctuations. So now you do know about logistic growth, okay, population, which is the growth pattern that you observe when population approaches a particular equilibrium, right? And remember, the population size at which the growth stabilizes is known as carrying capacity, right? So under logistic growth, we know that a relatively stable population size is reached, right? And so the total population size first increased rapidly, right? And then after that population reaches a critical density, right, the population size levels off, right? And then what happens is, after that particular point, certain population growths and declines happens, but that is to a kind of a minor degree. So the population fluctuations will happen to a minor degree. The overall shifts in population sizes after that particular point is going to be very little. So that fluctuation happens around the maximum sustainable population size, and that maximum sustainable population size is called the carrying capacity. Okay, so so if you remember from the population logistic growth model, I did mention that the carrying capacity is relatively a constant, right? It's the under a given environmental condition, that is the maximum number of individuals that that particular population can sustain. So theoretically, carrying capacity can be considered a constant, but realistically, in pragmatically speaking, carrying capacity may not be a constant. Okay, so so we are looking at a particular example in this particular case. We are looking at the sheep populations in Tasmania, right? So after sheep are introduced to Tasmania, it's an island in Australia, right? We do see that there was some increment, right, at the initial stage, and then what happens is some stabilization. But if you look at very smaller timescales, we do see that the sheep population is actually not kind of increasing linearly. It's actually kind of fluctuating, right? So despite the overall trend of first dramatic increase and then stabilization, you do see these rapid fluctuations in number of individuals in the Tasmanian sheep population. So now going back to my original question, like why not why cannot the carrying capacity be realistic, right? So before answering that question, I do want to address the fact that this particular graph, right, I mean, if you put an average around those values, you can actually kind of smooth out those curves, right? It would look something like this, right? And now if you look at that curve, that should remind you of the theoretical logistic growth, right? So the question is, like, why the realistic population curves are like this, right? Why cannot it look like, this beautiful smooth curve? Well, there are many reasons for that, right? One is actually the environmental conditions. If you're looking at that particular sheep population from 1820 to 1940, that's a lot. That's actually, over 100 years, right? Environmental conditions does not remain the same. So the environmental parameters impact, right, on the population also controls the population sizes. Remember that it's not only density dependent factors that can influence the population size. Density independent factors, those environmental factors, can also drive population changes. It's just that they don't regulate the overall population size, but those density independent factors can result in those weird fluctuations that you see in that particular graph. Now, going back to my question regarding carrying capacity, right? So theoretically, you expect something like this, right? Carrying capacity to be kind of a point value, but in pragmatic sense, carrying capacity is not a single value, rather it is a range, right? So the reason why the carrying capacity is a range is actually attributable to these fluctuations, right? Because of these fluctuations, in fact, the birth rate. So how can you define the carrying capacity? There are a couple of ways. One, I have already mentioned, that is the maximum population size that can be sustained in a given environment, in a given habitat, given the environmental conditions and the resource availability. More mathematically speaking, carrying capacity is the point at which birth rate equals the death rate, right? I mean, you can see, even when a population reaches carrying capacity, births will continue, deaths will continue, but birth rate and death rate will be equal at carrying capacity, right? Now, if you look at the graph on the top, you do see there are lots of fluctuations. That's because birth rate and death rate, right, are actually also going to be variable, right? So birth rate and death rate are also not smooth curves, rather they're actually ranges, right? So when those kind of the birth and death rate ranges overlap, it actually creates the actual range for carrying capacity, right? um, so answering the question, both of my questions, why this logistic growth curve is not smooth, why is it so, like, edgy, why do you have this sawtooth pattern, right? Why carrying capacity is not practically a point constant? Well, the reason is, depending on the environmental features, particularly depending on density independent growth influences, right, birth rate and death rate, right, are going to have a range of possible values, right? Birth rate and death rate are going to fluctuate dramatically around a particular mean value, right? So as a result, the population growth curves will be more will show this sawtooth like pattern, which will have dramatic fluctuations. It will not always be a theoretical smooth curve, right? At the same way, the carrying capacity will be actually a range rather than a point constant. So can the carrying capacity be a universal constant for a given species? Well, no, because there are several species occupying diverse types of environments occurring across continents, right? So the environmental conditions they face are not the same. So the birth rates and death rates will again vary based on the environmental conditions, right? Based on the both density dependent and density independent factors, birth and death rates will vary even for the same species, right? And even so across different populations of the same species, carrying capacity will not be a universal constant, right? Environmental conditions, will act through density independent growth influences and impact birth rates and death rates, which then will impact carrying capacity. As a result, carrying capacity is not a theoretical constant. Now, as you noticed in that particular Tasmanian sheep population growth curve, many populations will actually show dramatic fluctuations, right? If you kind of zoom into a narrower, shorter time window of a population growth curve, these dramatic fluctuations are going to be much more visible, right? Um, So population sizes, in other words, what do you mean by population fluctuations? Population sizes can rise and fall across time, right? And that fluctuation, as you can see in this moose versus wolf population, could be quite dramatic, and rather these fluctuations does tend to stay around a particular mean value. Nonetheless, the fluctuations are inevitable, right? In realistically, in the real world, you will never get those smooth population curves. So the fluctuation happens around the mean. So the extent of fluctuation is kind of the standard deviation, right, of the population that you're observing. And in fact, in the moose versus wolf case, their fluctuations could have a reason, right? Because wolves and moose interact, right? Wolf is the predator and moose is actually the prey, right? So when moose populations rise, right, you will expect when the it's easy to explain the other way around. When wolf population increases, right, the predation risk on moose also increases. So moose populations then goes down, right, and after a particular lag times, wolf population will also go down because there's fewer moose available for hunting, right? And after that, again, moose population will gradually increase because of the declining wolf population releases them from predation pressure, right? And when the moose population increases, then again wolf will have a lot of prey to predate on. So like that, between predator and prey, there will be kind of alternating fluctuations of population sizes. Now population outbreaks, right, is also another interesting phenomena observed in wild populations. That's also can be considered as an extreme case of population fluctuations, right? So comb jelly populations in the Black Sea, right, is an example for that. So following nutrient enrichment or eutrophication, right, the plankton community could actually exponentially increase, right, in oceanic environments, and following that, plankton feeding organisms like comb jelly can also increase in population sizes, right? So that's what happened to the comb jellies in Black Sea, right? Because of the increased availability of food resources, their population suddenly literally exploded in massive numbers. And in German pine forests, right, the outbreak of winter moths also led to a massive population outbreak, right? And in British Columbia of Canada, right, the pine beetles, mountain pine beetles, right, also rapidly expanded throughout pine forests, and that actually that outbreak was primarily driven by warming nighttime temperatures and warming winter temperatures in Canada. And in freshwater environments, right, you can actually think about many examples of algal blooming, right, where the freshwater phytoplankton underwent population outbreaks with respect to increasing nutrient availability, right? And then on the bottom figure, you are looking at gypsy moth, which actually expanded, which underwent population outbreaks in northeastern United States when it was introduced into northeastern US for the purpose of actually silk formation, to extract silk. To make fabric, but what happened was, some of them actually escaped into oak forests and established colonies in oak forests, and they underwent population outbreak throughout the oak forests of the northeastern United States, and right now it's actually even expanding into the northern midwestern environment. So in all of those cases, those are examples of population outbreaks. What happens is, a dramatic increment in resources, right, or releasing resource limitations could lead to population outbreaks, right? Then population cycles. Now this is somewhat related to what I mentioned to you earlier with respect to wolves and moose, right? So I mentioned that that in the case of moose and wolves, right, the fluctuations you see in individual populations, kind of corresponds to each other. When moose population increases, right, with a certain lag time, the wolf population increases because of the increased prey availability, and then with the increased prey availability, moose population with increased prey availability, wolf population increases first, right, and concurrently moose populations decline, right? And that kind of corresponding rises and falls of population sizes, right, creates population cycles, right? So alternating high and low abundance, right, that happens in constant intervals of time is actually what we define as a population cycle. Another example that I'm showing you over here, which is much more clearer, is the predator-prey interaction between snowshoe hare and the lynx, right? In these kind of things have been very extensively studied in Canada. Um, in fact, if you look at any well, in terms of experimental evidence, if you look at small rodents, lemming populations, wolves, like any of those small prey, right, you could observe them undergoing these population cycles, where alternating high and low or peaks and valleys occurring in their population growth curves. Um, so what drives these kind of population cycles, particularly with respect to these small mammals? Well, there could be many factors. One of them is actually predation, right? And we will come back to that. And I've already explained that a little bit already. Some of them are internal, right? Some of these population cycles are generated in response to overcrowding, right? So particularly the small mammals like rodents and lemmings, wolves, they are community dwelling organisms, species, right? They actually, some of them have um, some of them show social behavior or group behavior where they den in multiple numbers. So when their population sizes increase, right, it kind of creates a very high crowding environment, right? And that high, in order to prevent high crowding or overcrowding, what happens is certain hormonal responses happen to limit overcrowding, right? And these hormonal changes could actually result in reduced reproductive success, decreased fertility, or ceased ovulation in females, or reduced reproductive vigor in males, or drive certain species, certain individuals of that colony to leave that particular den and go in search of another habitat. So certain endocrinal regulations could also kick in under high crowding, high density situations, which then in return deregulates the increase in population size, right? And then, like I mentioned earlier, there are external factors like predation and food availability, right? If you wonder like why lynx populations are going up and down, well, that's because when the hare population goes down, they have less food available, so there's more competition for limited food, so that brings their population size down. Competition is also a density dependent regulation, so is predation, right? So is the endocrinal changes I mentioned about. So these population cycles are largely regulated by density dependent population regulators, right? And also density independent factors like climate, right? And can 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 drive this behavior, right? Particularly seasonality in the climate, right? If the seasonality is predictable in certain climates, the environmental conditions are more favorable. In the other time, it is not, right? So you will see this rise and falls, right? Particularly in insect communities. During spring and summer, insect populations increase, and during winter and fall they decline or plummet, right? And particularly if you are looking at a habitat that repeatedly undergo recurrent periodic environmental catastrophes like wildfire in savannas or wildfire in tropical scrublands, right? Wildfire itself will actually create mortality and increased resource availability, right? So and following such environmental catastrophes, you will also get these peaks and valleys in population cycles. Population extinction. Now, what is extinction? Meaning actually where population size falls down to zero, right? So let me try to explain extinction based on lambda, which is actually the standard for rate of population growth, right? Now, if lambda starts declining, meaning if the population growth rate starts to plummet, right, you're looking at a situation where the birth rate is not high enough to replace individuals that are dying, right? So over time, if number of individuals dying is greater than the number of individuals that are born, that particular population over the time will become extinct. If population growth rate is greater than 1, right, that population suffers little to no risk of extinction. What do you mean by lambda being greater than 1? Well, that's an instant where number of newborns are greater than the number of individuals that are dying. In that case, you are actually effectively adding more individuals to that particular population, so the risk of extinction is fairly low, right? But what if the lambda is less than 1? Then number of individuals that are dying is greater than the number of individuals are born. So the newborns are not replacing the deaths. So that population faces a much greater extinction risk, right? If the current population size is larger, well, of course, the time for extinction may be longer, but still, right, eventually, unless that population increases its lambda, the population growth rate, you are looking at an inevitable extinction risk in a matter of time. So what if a particular population undergoes dramatic fluctuations in a shorter period of time, right? Look at the graph to your right, So in fact, simulation studies, right, computer simulations or statistical modeling, right, have shown that if a particular population undergoes dramatic fluctuations, meaning dramatic rises and falls of population, that also leads to destability of that particular population, right? And ultimately, with these dramatic fluctuations, lots of highs and lows, will eventually slow the net population growth rate, thereby increasing the population risk. So, as shown by these mathematical simulations, dramatic fluctuations in lambda also increases the extinction risk of that particular population, right? And the more severe these dramatic fluctuations, right, the greater the risk of extinction, as you see in this particular graph, right? And so yes, the higher the variation of lambda, right? Remember what I mentioned about the standard deviation, the values, the ups and downs around the mean, right? So greater that variation, right, higher the risk of extinction. Now, let me give you explain this phenomena with respect to some examples from a more applied sense. So what kind of population have the greatest risk of extinction? Smaller populations have a much higher risk of extinction. Why? Well, smaller populations have very few reproductively mature individuals, right? Because in a given population, not all individuals are reproductively mature, right? In fact, not even all reproductively mature individuals have the chance of reproducing, right? So if there are only, if the overall population size is smaller by, statistical theory, by the probability theory, you know that the number of reproductively mature individuals in that population is also larger, is also smaller. So only fewer offsprings can be produced by pairing between those reproductively mature individuals, right? As a result, smaller populations are also a lot more prone to chance events, right? They can suffer massive amounts of mortality by simply due to bad luck, right? Because of the current standing population size is smaller, some random dumb luck can actually dramatically decline the standing population even further, increasing their extinction risk. And also, if you remember from the evolution lecture, I talked about genetic drift, right? These non-random events that predisposes certain individuals to death, right? So genetic drift, right, is also extremely influential in smaller populations, which is a fact I mentioned when I introduced you the concept of genetic drift. So and again, genetic drift is a random fluctuations, right? Random fluctuations in number of gene variants or number of alleles in a population over time, right? So and that kind of random fluctuations can happen with respect to death of a handful of individuals in that particular population, right? Smaller the population, the greater the impact of losing few alleles. And also, low frequency alleles can be eliminated faster in a smaller population, right? So smaller populations, in that case, will actually fast reach lower genetic diversity. So what's the problem with reaching lower genetic diversity? Well, it is the genetic diversity that actually creates a backbone for adaptation. That is actually the backbone for evolution. That's how new genes arise through mutation, right? Mutation of the existing genetic diversity. But if you have very little genetic variation left, maybe because of the smaller population size plus genetic drift, right? You are actually having a lower opportunity to adapt to changing environmental conditions, right? And also think about what happens to harmful alleles, right? Those lethal alleles in a given population, right? Well, by random dumb luck, right, if the population size is smaller, that is undergoing genetic drift, then that particular population will also accumulate a greater frequency of harmful alleles, right? And some of those harmful alleles can actually result lethality. Meaning what? Like especially certain lethal alleles actually increases the stillborn risk, right? And also in certain cases, those harmful alleles could actually reduce fertility. I will give you a couple of examples later on, right? So overall, these harmful alleles, if they increase in frequency, that will actually reduce the reproductive success or survival. One quick example I can think of in this regard is actually albinosis or leucism, right? So both of them refers to what? Albino is actually albino individuals lack color, right? They actually are white in their coloration. Generally, like if it is a mammal, you will get white fur. If it is a bird, you get white feathers, right? Leucism is a very similar situation where you can produce pigmentation, but you cannot produce darker colors or darker pigmentation. So your pigments are much more lighter in color, right? It's kind of a partial form of leucism, but the genetic background behind those two are quite different. So what's the problem with albinism or leucism? Well, if you are an albino individual and that's a genetic problem, right? That's actually coming with albinism is brought about by combination of two recessive genes. If it is recessive homozygous, you actually suffer from albinism. So albino individuals have a lower chance of recruiting mates, right? And they are too conspicuous, they cannot camouflage in a particular environment, so there's a greater predation risk, right? And also certain pigmentation are also important for greater vision, right, or better vision, right? So lack of these pigmentations can also impair their visibility or the environmental sensing. So generally albino individuals are a poor fit to the environment, right? But in a smaller population, there's a greater risk of individuals becoming albinos, so which actually further declines their mating success and individual survival. Also, inbreeding depression can also increase in small populations, if that a small population is undergoing genetic drift, the inbreeding depression can also accentuate. What do you mean by inbreeding depression? I'm pretty sure you have a basic idea what that means. So inbreeding depression is when closely related individuals, genetically similar individuals of the same population, right, starts interbreeding with each other, right, is actually inbreeding depression. What is the problem with that is actually that kind of interbreeding will actually further increase the expression of harmful alleles, right, particularly those recessive genes that are lethal, like lethal or sublethal, like the case of albinism, right, can express at a greater frequency under inbreeding depression. When related individuals mate, there's a greater chance of two recessive alleles coming together in a single individual, right? And also other problem is actually if breeding happens between two individuals that are closely related to each other, you're thinking about like inter-sibling mating, or between cousin mating, right? That kind of a situation will prevent genetic admixing, mixing of different genes between distally related individuals, which increases the genetic diversity, right? Inbreeding decreases the genetic diversity and leads to a highly homozygous population, right? Where the population shares very similar genes, very similar alleles. That's what we call genetic homozygosity, right? So to put everything into this perspective, smaller populations can undergo inbreeding and leads to inbreeding depression. Smaller populations are susceptible to random events like genetic drift. Collectively, inbreeding and genetic drift will lead to reduced genetic diversity, right? Look at this diagram. Small populations, greater inbreeding, greater genetic diversity, reduces genetic diversity. In return, what happens with the reduced genetic diversity? The fitness of that population is lower. Why? Because without much genetic diversity, they cannot resist, tolerate different environmental conditions. Well, what happens when the population fitness is lower? Well, their reproduction goes down, mortality goes up, birth rate goes down. As a result, the population becomes even smaller, and that actually creates a feedback loop, further extenuating inbreeding depression, furthering the negative impacts of genetic drift. So this particular cycle actually can keep going on and on and on. In conservation biology, we call this phenomena where small populations increasingly becoming smaller because of the continued inbreeding depression and genetic drift and subsequent loss of genetic diversity. We call that extinction vortex. Small populations over time become smaller where their risk of extinction getting exponentially greater. For the last point, for a theoretical example, let's look at the graph on the top. You are looking at devil's hole pupfish population, right? We talked about that particular species in a previous lecture with respect to population abundance and distribution. Let's look at the graph and understand these axes. X-axis, we are looking at population size. There are two y-axes. One is median time to extinction, meaning how long will it take for that particular population to become extinct in terms of years. On the other y-axis, you are looking at probability of extinction of 10 years, right? So meaning, what is the probability, what is the chance of a particular population going extinct within the next decade, right? So median time to extinction is inversely proportional to the probability of extinction within the next decade, okay? So the circles corresponds to median time to extinction. The squares correspond to probability of extinction within the next decade. Blues spring, reds fall, right? So you are looking at this devil hole pupfish population trends, right? Well, what do you see? When the population size increases, the median time to extinction goes up. Look what's happening over here, right? When the population increases, time to extinction also increases, meaning they are going to be more stable. Well, what happened to the probability of extinction with the increasing population size? Well, with increasing population size, chance of extinction also goes down. So kind of, it's a practical example to highlight my point. All right, let's move on. This is another practical example. Actually, it's a very interesting conservation story with respect to these lion populations, right? So, and I am particularly going to talk about a lion population that is restricted to this Njoro crater. If you can properly pronounce Njoro, like I actually can give you extra credits. I'm joking. I cannot properly pronounce it, right? So, Njoro is actually a crater habitat which is created by an erupted volcano. So this lion population living in Njoro crater lives on the top of a former volcano, right? Now it's not an active volcano, it was a volcano and it erupted and has created this huge plateau on the top of the Njoro mountain range. And that is located in the Eastern African nation, Tanzania. It's actually a really cool country, an African country, which is extremely high in biodiversity, right? And they have, that particular crater has this surviving lion population. So this Tanzanian lion population suffered a fly infestation, some time ago. And this is actually what you're observing right over here, right? So with the fly infestation, they actually kind of starts feeding off of the lion, and they actually feed on the areas where are not covered by fur, where they can actually tap into blood, right, and other body fluids, right? So that's why you see so many flies on this lion's face, right? So that's actually a nuisance, right? And and there are like hundreds and thousands of flies feeding simultaneously on the lion, so it actually kind of draws the body fluid down. It decreases their fitness, it decreases their survival, it makes them more prone to other diseases, right? So the fly infestation dramatically plummeted the population size of these Tanzanian lions, of this Njoro lion population, where because of the infestation, the population actually was originally about 60 to 75 before the infestation. Because of the infestation, it dropped to 15 individuals, right? 15 breeding individuals, right? And well, with 15 breeding individuals, the population recovery happened, but it was very, very slow. It happened, but extremely slow, right? And took decades for that to happen. And lions are not breeding every, like seasonally. They only breed seasonally, and they don't breed every season, right? So within 10 years, right, the population recovered up to over 100, about 125 individuals. But even after that population recovery, the genetic diversity was quite low. Why? Because the fly infestation killed so many individuals in the original population, and the surviving individuals were quite genetically similar, right? And this kind of a situation, we call it a genetic bottlenecking, right? Where an originally highly diverse population, right, or high genetic diverse genetic elements underwent a bottleneck, right? And the bottleneck event was driven by the fly infestation, and only a few individuals survived. So consequently, you only have fewer individuals, and those individuals happen to be genetically similar. So what happened is actually, with this, even in this population recovery, right, they only actually had 9 females and 1 male, right? So think about how bad the situation is, right? All the offspring sired by these 9 females, right, had the same daughter. All the offspring sired by these 9 females had the same dad, right? So 50% of their genes are coming from this same male. That further, right, extenuated the extinction risk that actually resulted in inbreeding, right? Extremely high level of inbreeding and extremely high level of genetic drift, further declining their genetic diversity, right? And in fact, in order to fully recover this population, right, how did that happen? Well, you are looking at a crater, right? So the emigration, right, movement of individuals from other environments was fairly lower, right? So, but over the time, what happens? Luckily, somehow, naturally, certain individuals migrated into Njoro crater and established themselves, and kind of through this migration, kind of introduced the gene flow, which further increased the genetic diversity, and then the actual population bounce back was much more successful, because then the subsequent population bounce back also increased the genetic diversity, right? With a single male breeding with 9 females, genetic diversity did not bounce back. So it's a really interesting story, and in fact, I wanted to mention one more thing, like another, like I mentioned that with population reduction, right, with small populations, I said inbreeding depression kicks in, right? I mentioned some of the adversities of genetic drift and inbreeding depression is reduced fertility. This is one example. When you see when two related individuals actually breed, these males right, that are actually particularly the males that are born to this single male and 9 females, they suffer infertility because the sperms produced by those males, inbred males, had 2 heads. Sperms with 2 heads cannot move effectively, right? So so those generations coming out of those 9 females versus 1 male were extremely low in fertility, right? So this kind of sperm malformations is an evolutionary adaptation to minimize inbreeding, okay? Because inbreeding does not lead to increased genetic diversity. So for a population survival, evolutionary, it's beneficial to evolve mechanisms to decrease inbreeding success or inbreeding opportunity. So that's why, you know, these kind of malformation happens. If you wonder why on earth these kind of things happen, because those malformed sperms are actually evolutionary adaptive to prevent inbreeding depressions and to increase crossbreeding, which enhances the genetic diversity, which ensures the adaptability of that particular population. But weirdly enough, in small populations that are isolated, that kind of malformations could actually negatively impact that particular population, dragging it further towards extinction, right? And now we are looking at another example from the right side, which is coming from the Channel Island birds in California, right? And what is happening over here, Channel Islands are actually those islands off the coast of California, right? And look at the graph now. Looking at on x-axis, number of breeding pairs, y-axis, extinct populations, right? So when the number of breeding pairs are extremely low, particularly anywhere below 100, right, you are looking at a relatively high extinction percentage extinctions, right? If the breeding pair, if the number of breeding pairs are like 10, right, the extinction, at least 20% of the populations went extinct, right? And if the number of breeding pairs increases all the way up to 100, right, the extinction risk is actually lower than 5%, right? If the number of individuals that are breeding, right, or the number of breeding pairs are about 1,000, the extinction risk is 0%, right? There's almost no risk of extinction, at least theoretically speaking. Right? It's a really cool example to highlight how increasing population sizes also increases the survival, right? Or decreases the extinction risk. It's kind of intuitive, but what I want you to do is understand the principle or the mechanism behind it. So now we are looking at another example where we are looking into the extinction risk of British breeding birds, right? And we are looking at multiple species over here, over 60 breeding birds in British Islands. And we are plotting them against a mean number of nesting pairs against the inverse to the time to extinction, right? Inverse time to the extinction is actually what do you mean by inverse? 1 over time to extinction, right? So we clearly see evidence for decreased risk of extinction with increasing number of breeding pairs, right? And this phenomena, right, decreased extinction risk with increasing breeding pairs or increasing population sizes, hold constant for large as well as small-bodied birds, for residential breeders, for migrating breeders, right? So this principle is applicable to different species with different life history strategies with different functional attributes, right? Next, I'm going to talk to you about different forms of phenomena, stochastic phenomena that actually are responsible for, that can drive population towards extinction. So first, I'm going to talk about demographic stochasticity. What is demographic stochasticity? Demographic stochasticity is the variability in population growth rates that's arising from random differences among individuals in terms of survival and reproduction within a particular season. Again, what is demographic stochasticity? That is the variability between individual variability in a given population that results in variable survival and reproductive success, which then contributes to variation in the population growth, right? So simply demographic stochasticity refers to the random variations, random fluctuations in individual level survival and reproductive success in a given population for a given season. Okay, and needless to say, those random variations in survival and reproduction, mathematically speaking, can influence the overall population growth rate. So how does demographic stochasticity influence populations and predispose that towards extinction? Well, if you are looking at a larger population, right, like we just went through a couple of examples, if you're looking at a larger population, these random individual level variations in their survival and reproductive fitness is not going to matter that much, right? Because there are so many other individuals in the population that can buffer and account for these poor performing individuals, right? You know, in fact, these random variations may not be process driven. That's why I said random variations in individuals. It could be in a particular season, even highly fit individuals in that particular population may have weaknesses in terms of their survival and reproduction, right? By random bad luck, right? So by a very chance mishap, you know, something can go wrong regardless of these individual fitnesses. But the benefit of a large population is if you have so many individuals in the population, there are so many reproductively active individuals that can buffer for those bad luck events. But if your population is small, the bad luck can be magnified through the population, right? So how this happens is actually through Alley effect. Now, what is Alley effect? Alley effect is a biological population level phenomena that is characterized by a correlation between population size and or population density versus the mean individual fitness. And the mean individual fitness is measured often by per capita population growth rate. What is per capita? What do you mean by per capita? Per capita meaning per individual population growth rate, right? So what Alley effect predicts is that population growth declines with decreasing population density, right? Population growth rate declines with decreasing population density. That's what Alley effect predicts, right? So Alley effect, again, to define it, is a biological population scale phenomena where you observe a correlation between population size or population density and the mean individual fitness measured as per capita growth rate, right? So the outcome is, if the density goes down, if the population density goes down or the population size goes down, then the growth rate also declines. Why? Well, again, this should not be a surprise. Okay, this should be very intuitive. But what I want you to do is understand the why component, understand the mechanism. If the population size is lower, the population density is also going to be lower. What is the connection between density and size? Size divided by the surface area is density, right? If the population is lower in density, then the probability of two reproductively active males and females interacting with each other or encountering with each other is lower. So the probability of mating goes down with lower density. And if that is down, then of course the reproductive fitness also goes down. As a result, the population growth also slows down. Well, this could be much more, this problem could be much more severe in species that are dependent on social environments. On my top figure, you are looking at a flightless parakeet that is endemic to New Zealand, right? Um, so, so for these guys, this actually social bird, they nest actually kind of below ground or right at the surface of the ground. They are ground nesting birds and they nest in colonies. There are many other social organisms that actually require a large number of individuals to form a cohesive um, social group, right? Most of the cliff nesting birds, shorebirds, and other forms of wetland birds are actually depending on large aggregations, large social or quasi-social units or groups to form colonies, right? If you have if the total number of individuals are lower than that threshold, they will not form colonies. They will actually not reproduce. The reason is actually, it's a kind of a number, safety in number kind of a thing. When there are so many individuals forming a colony, you actually have more vigilant eyes to protect the colony from predators. Also, the larger the number of individuals, better they are equipped to compete with rival other species. And with the larger number, of course, a single male can actually sire several females, and most of these socially nesting birds are actually forming what you known as harems, right? So meaning one male siring offsprings by mating with multiple females. So for all of these reasons, they require a larger number, right, in their colony. And also, even if a predator attacks, if there are larger numbers, the probability of one individual being predated goes lower. So there are many reasons why social aggregations make sense. But the point I want to deliver over here is what will happen to those social or group behaving species or populations if the population size goes down, right? The alley effect will magnify in those guys multiple times over, right? Because it's not just this reduced mating chances that they're encountering. They actually have their cohesion of the social group is threatened by declining population sizes. In fact, the colonies collapse out of blue. Like the birds leave the colony if the population size keeps going down. Same thing regarding schooling fish. Now, schooling fish are not actually social groups. Those are groups, right? They are individuals of the same species aggregate regardless of their relatedness. That's again an anti-predator strategy, which actually results in predator delusion, where a predator cannot actually kind of attack a single fish when they school, and also the chance of a single fish being eaten by a predator goes down when they're behaving in groups, right? So for them too, the group cohesion depends on having large numbers, right? So and if they cannot school in large numbers, that also decreases their survival. So my point is, species behaving that are dependent on large social or group aggregations will disproportionately suffer if they're subjected to population decline, ultimately reaching smaller populations. So now let's talk about another form of stochasticity that influence population survival and extinction. Environmental stochasticity. By definition, environmental stochasticity comes from variability of environmental conditions. This includes climate, critical biological resources, habitat availability, food availability. So if these changes in the environment happen to be sudden, unpredictable, and erratic, right, that kind of dramatic changes can result in much dramatic impacts, negative impacts on the population's survival, thereby pushing them more towards extinction, right? And then this could be as simply as good versus bad seasons, right? Certain growth seasons, certain summer and spring seasons actually could favor species survival, but at the same time, certain changes in the weather pattern and the climate and other environmental phenomena can result a poor season, which actually could impact their survival for the rest of the year until another good season comes back. For example, many species occupying dry tropical or subtemperate habitats are heavily dependent on monsoon rains, to supply moisture and water for those habitats, which has to be sustained for the rest of the year, right? For some weird reason, what if those monsoons did not result in as much precipitation as expected? Then that will become a bad season, and that environmental impact of reduced precipitation during monsoon can be carried over until the next monsoon season. Okay, so and we know that these environmental variables like climate, weather, physical structural features of the habitat, and nutrient availability, food availability, all of those can impact the birth rate and death rate. If they are better, birth rate goes high, death rate goes down. If they are poor, the environmental conditions are bad, then it's the other way around. Now, fluctuations in environmental conditions also impacts fluctuations in population growth rates. And we mentioned to you that earlier, if these fluctuations are dramatic, right, that will also increases the chance of extinction for that particular species. By the way, that kind of the impacts, the negative impacts of dramatic fluctuations are also greater in small populations. And think about these extreme climatic events, extreme environmental catastrophes like unexpected wildfire, floods that are untimely, a windstorm, right, canopy throwdown, hurricanes, right, especially the ones that we keep getting in the Gulf of Mexico, a new pathogen or a disease that actually has been accidentally or intentionally introduced for a particular habitat, pest outbreaks, all of those are extreme environmental catastrophes that could be responsible for population extinction. If a particular species exists only as a single population, right, or if all populations in a given species occur in very close proximity to each other, right, the negative impacts of these extreme environmental catastrophes are quite high, right? Now, wanted to tell you a couple of good examples here with regard to environmental catastrophes and how that actually resulted in population extinctions. First, let's talk about the top image, right? The sea urchin. Sea urchin mass mortality has been observed in Southern California as well as Caribbean islands, on the two opposite coasts of North America. In Southern California, the sea urchin mass mortality, meaning like a lot of urchins dying at the same time, was a result of a viral wasting disease that inflicted those populations. In Caribbean islands, it was a bacterial infection that resulted in a mass mortality, right? So actually because of that, those mass mortalities, at least temporary, those urchin populations for Southern California, 3 species were temporarily extirpated from Southern California. Very similar situation in Caribbean islands. Baikal seals of Russia, it's actually an extinct seal species. A viral infection called canine distemper virus, which is the same virus that actually infects dogs, right? Or the same thing that dogs can catch from wolves and coyotes, right? Actually have infected the Baikal seals. We don't know how the jump happened, but it happened. So because of this pathogenic shift, between related individuals, don't forget that the seals and the canines are closely related. They both are carnivores. One is aquatic, one is terrestrial, right? But they still share lots of similarities. So it's not a surprise that a pathogen jumped, right, from one species to another that belongs to essentially to the same family. So, and also similar events of mass mortalities and near population extinctions have been observed in sea stars. And particularly in Pacific Ocean and definitely in Pacific Ocean, but similar observations has also been made in Atlantic Ocean. So This is also related to a chronic wasting disease, similar to the chronic wasting disease I described to you earlier with respect to sea urchins. In this case, first the wasting disease starts with lesions, right? Like topical lesions, and then and the lesions becomes severe, and so the entire body of these sea urchins kind of fragments, right? Kind of fragments, and the body part falls apart in that case, and then ultimately, of course, when the body falls apart, the animal dies, right? So this wasting disease, when it first appears as lesions, it actually spreads rapidly all over the starfish as well as the entire starfish populations, because they actually, there's close physical proximity between to starfishes. The same thing regarding urchins. If you catch one urchin, there's a good chance you will catch another in that particular environment. So echinoderms live in very close proximity to each other. I don't consider that as a group behavior, but it's kind of a random fact that they aggregate in their habitats. And so first the lesion starts, and then the lesion expands, leading to tissue decay, and that tissue decay kind of fragments body parts, and the body parts falls off in sea urchins. In fact, I'm not talking about sea urchins right now. I'm talking about starfishes. So you know that starfishes can regenerate their bodies, but the weird thing is, because if a starfish loses a limb because of this wasting disease, they do not regrow it back, they die, right? And it's not actually a quick death. What happens is actually, with this wasting disease, with the limbs or tissue parts being falling off, the animals kind of become limp. They become really bad at moving even when the infection first starts. It actually not only spreads topically, like on the surface. No, it actually infects their water vascular system, which is actually primary mechanism that they actually use for hunting and feeding and locomotion, right? So the water vascular system malfunction, so they are no longer able to maintain their movements, nor are they able to maintain their hydrostatic stability or hydrostatic balance, right? So they cannot actually move properly on a substrate, they cannot grasp substrates properly. So and kind of and certain occasions, because of the inability for them to maintain their physical form, they actually start to kind of twitch, right? And limbs falling off. It's kind of a horrible thing to see. Like, there are several videos that you can look up on starfish wasting disease, and in fact, in certain cases, there are some documentation that after the limbs fell off, the limb starts crawling around, and those crawling limbs further loses its structural integrity. So it's kind of a very horrible disease. I should stop talking about, because it's kind of can give you nightmares. And right now I'm recording that lecture right before Halloween. All right. So the last concept I want to touch base is actually metapopulation concept. So let me gradually get to metapopulation concept. Now guys, when you hear these words like metapopulation concept or metapopulation principle, theory, don't try to boil down all my explanations to a single sentence. You cannot explain theories in ecology in a single sentence. You actually require like a paragraph, multiple sentences to explain a particular concept, right? So I kind of see students misunderstanding a particular principle or a concept or a theory. For the metapopulations, we call it metapopulation theory. It's not a single sentence, okay? It's actually rather an explanation on how populations interact. So let me get to the bottom of it. In nature, habitats are patchily distributed. Habitats may not be necessarily continuous, and certain habitats may be seasonally continuous, and in certain times they may actually become discrete or isolated. So non-continuous series of isolated favorable habitats can exist across a landscape. Think about wetlands, right, that actually speckle forests or woodland or grassland habitats, right? Some of those wetlands, as you see in my image, might become continuous when ephemeral streams arise. If you could remember one of my examples regarding those desert pupfishes, those desert pupfish occurs in desert ponds, and their continuity is so ephemeral, it only evident or observable during monsoon seasons when ephemeral streams link those isolated ponds together. So think about a very similar situation over here, right? And so when the same species colonize these isolated or temporarily discrete habitats, right, they actually form discrete populations of the same species that are spatially isolated, at least for the most of the year, right, which can be temporarily connected in certain seasons. So in order for a population to maintain its integrity, individuals migrate from one population to another, right, through dispersal, right? And we also know that sometimes if individuals don't migrate, gametes can also be responsible for connecting those discrete isolated populations, right? In certain times, in certain seasons, certain gametes or certain individuals will migrate from their source population and end up in a sink population, right? The sources of the gametes or the individuals is the source population. Where they end up is the sink population. So when this gamete or dispersal or individual dispersal happens in spatially isolated populations, right, we call that connectivity resulting from migrating individuals or dispersing gametes as a metapopulation. So a metapopulation essentially is spatially isolated populations that are intermittently linked or connected by dispersing individuals or dispersing gametes, right? So this kind of phenomena, this metapopulation phenomena triggered by migrating individuals or adults or dispersing individuals or adults creates a source sink dynamics across that landscape within the metapopulation, right? Now, a particular population within the metapopulation that functioned as a source could function as a sink in a subsequent year or in a subsequent season, right? And vice versa. And in certain cases, some populations within the metapopulation is so robust, they will continue to function as a source population. Unfortunately, some of the populations in a metapopulation are so poor in habitat condition, they actually becomes a sink, right? Now, let me explain the sources and sink a little bit more over here, right? So, you know that habitats are patchily distributed in landscapes, and different numbers of individuals occur in those isolated patchy habitats, and they form populations. So, in a given metapopulation, right, you're looking at multiple populations occurring in those discrete isolated habitats, right? And over time, extinction could happen in some of those habitats. Let me get my point over here. It's really easy to explain. Okay, so first, yeah, a metapopulation is made out of multiple small populations, and each population is established in a given discrete isolated habitat. And over time, due to some chance processes or due to environmental or demographic stochasticity, certain populations may completely become extinct within the metapopulation, so leaving these vacant habitats, okay, the vacant areas, vacant resource bases. And then what happens is, because of meta-community interactions and meta-community dynamics, some populations, although when they go extinct with time, migrating individuals, migrating adults, or dispersing propagule, right, will establish in those vacant habitats, right? Now, what is a propagule? Propagule is actually the different types of reproductive units, right? For example, a propagule could be a seed, not an eggs or sperms. A zygote is a propagule because eggs themselves or sperms themselves cannot grow into a new individual. So anything that can grow into a new individual is a propagule. So eggs are uh, zygotes are, or fertilized eggs are propagules, zygotes are propagules, spores are propagules, seeds are propagules, right? Any broken piece of a stem of a vegetation is a propagule, right? Anything that can actually grow into a full individual independently is a propagule. So the point is, if propagules or individuals establish themselves with time through metapopulation interactions in these empty vacant habitats, those founding individuals, right, will actually become the first colonizers of the extinct habitat, and they will establish a new population, right? And if the dispersion rates, migration rates, or movements are faster among different populations of the metapopulation, then the re-establishment of the population is happening faster, right? So this kind of movement of individuals or propagules from a source population into a sink, into a population sink, or to a vacant habitat where extinction has happened, right, is called a rescue effect. Think about this, right? It is actually these dispersing individuals from source populations, or propagules coming from source populations, rescuing that particular habitat from extinction. That's what this re-establishment, recolonization does. So this phenomena that I explained to you is called the rescue effect, right? And as you see in the third panel, what you're looking at is migrating individuals or dispersing adults or propagules from source populations into extinct habitats, extinct or vacant habitats, ensures establishment of that extinct population over time. This is called the rescue effect. So this extinction that you observed earlier is temporary because the migrating, dispersing individuals or propagules can re-establish that population. Well, with that, we end this particular lecture on population dynamics. All right, guys, have fun. I'll see you in another lecture. Bye-bye.